Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. I thought I would continue my Halloween horror filmed theme of the month broadly by ticking off a film that, frankly, as someone who claims to be a lover of horror, someone who has delved into the depths of horror, both classic and contemporary, claims to have a real passion and understanding for, a film that I have almost willfully missed out at this point on is 2014's Drag Me to Hell. Because Sam Raimi is... there's something about him that so balances the right tone and style of horror and comedy and fantasy and I don't know, this sort of colour palette to his world building. But frankly, when we look at, contemporary horror filmmakers like the James Wans and the Blumhouses and, the Ari Asters, sort of, I feel like really Sam Raimi's influence should be felt throughout their styles, because he just knows how to tell such a good story and knows how to present horror that we have seen before and will continue to see repeated again and again, and yet present it in a way that is fresh and crafted such that it feels like it's something we haven't seen before. I mean, going back to sort of his origins with the Evil Dead trilogy. Now I will confess, I've never been the biggest lover of Army of Darkness. It was actually the first Sam Raimi film I ever saw, because it kind of leaned more into the goofiness and the overtop fantasy elements than it does the horror. But then circling back, when you look at sort of the original Evil Dead and then Evil Dead 2, I mean, I really love the original Evil Dead film. I think there is something to that film that really... it felt like one of the filmmakers who ushered in a new era of horror storytelling, and through a film like The Evil Dead. And although, of course, Evil Dead 2 is almost a mulligan of that film, where he got a chance to do it again, but make some changes, inject some different kinds of personality into it. I don't know, that first Evil Dead is so raw and visceral, and although there are mistakes made, particularly the tree scene, it's the fact that it's so fresh just gives it this I don't know, this brutality that I think a lot of other filmmakers probably just wouldn't get close to. And of course, people have said Sam Raimi, even in his non-horror films, injects that sense of... he knows how to craft horror even in non-horror contexts. So, of course, people, in fact, watched a video essay recently deconstructing the surgery scene from Spider-Man 2, where, of course, the claws are all coming out and murdering the surgeons, and the entire sequence is presented as a horror film sequence. And it is, and even every beat of it, the choreography of it, everything feels like a horror film throughout that sequence. And again, it shows someone who knows how to craft true horror. And so, yeah, for whatever reason, I completely Drag Me to Hell came up. I remember vividly when it was being screened. And for whatever reason, I just outright ignored it. And then throughout the years, for the near decade since it's been out, it's the kind of film that I have just sort of gone, oh well, maybe I'll watch it, maybe I'll get around to it. I don't want to have a disappointing time with a very by-the-numbers horror film. And that is such a... it's lowering the expectations of someone who I should have trusted to be able to make a great horror film. Because Drag Me to Hell, it really does feel, like I say, he knows how to present things we've seen before, but in a new and fresh way. And there are even just elements of his storytelling and his crafting and his character work that, you take your lead, Christine, who is, who could so easily have been a very generic horror lead. But because he knows how to take a character who could have been a by-the-numbers sort of what you might default human for then horror to happen to. It's because so many horrors, of course, give you that. They lean into the worst aspects of antagonist theory, I suppose, where your antagonist needs to be as generic, as down the line as possible, because it allows people to identify with them if they are a clean slate. The less relatable, the more relatable they are, the more generic they are, the more everyone can identify with them because they are just your introductory character. Now, I personally hate that ethos for filmmaking. I think it patronizes audiences into thinking that they are, it expects audiences not to have the ability to be able to empathize with the experiences of other people. And with horror, particularly, it is a common theme that a lot of basic horror stories give you, of course, well known, the idea of the group of teenagers who are there essentially as cannon fodder. And of course, a film like Cabin in the Woods deconstructed the idea of character archetypes and why we are presented with certain archetypal leads in our horror films. But the beauty of Drag Me to Hell is, like I say, Christine could have been a very basic character, and yet, and of course, partly to the credit of Sam Raimi and partly to the credit of Alison Lohman, this character has so much personality, and so many layers to her that, you have this sense of a character who's so well put together, and so, is on top of everything. A character who takes everything in her stride, has built herself to be this perfect person. And it's all a metaphor for the fact that she is in a environment where she is constantly being put down and her job is being put at risk. The fact that she has this history with a single alcoholic mother, and the fact that she herself she has this sort of colourful backstory that I'll unpack in a second. And yet, she works so hard to be this pristine, sort of pristine Christine kind of situation where, no hair out of place. And yet, of course, when she confronts Mrs. Gunash and then, of course, the Lamia, it shows how slowly this artifice, this facade is stripped away layer by layer until you really meet the true Christine, and she finally gets to be the version of herself that is real. And like I say, the great thing about this film is because there's so much personality to her and to the world and to the relationships, it allows deeper and more interesting readings into the storytelling. So, of course, I would be remiss to say that I saw a different video essay some years ago about Drag Me to Hell, and the metaphor that, her story is one about eating disorders and the idea of a young woman who is having to deal with having a psychological crisis with a history of some kind of eating disorder, whether it be bulimia or what's the other one called? Anorexia. And the idea, because you're told things about this character, and they're simply lines that are dropped that could mean nothing and could mean something. The fact that she was called that she works very hard to on her accent. Of course, when we're introduced to her, she tries to make her cadence and her lexis perfect. because again it's part of the artifice, with the implication, and later into the film it outright states that, you know, she is a country girl. She is from, you know, probably some Midwestern or southern part of America where she clearly did have a thicker accent. And, you know, there is something more of the country girl about her, you know, and so you get that sense of, you know, and of course she's referred to, you know, she seemingly was something called the Pig Queen, which it implies that, you know, some like local custom, and whether it was some kind of taunt or whether it was something she genuinely was sort of, you know, like a countryside prom queen sort of situation. But then that feeds into another sort of character fragment that is dropped, that you know, when she visits Mrs. Gunash's granddaughter, and the granddaughter says, "Oh, you were fat as a young woman, as a child, weren't you?" And she says, "Well, yes." And the idea that still plays on her mind. And as I say, there's a really interesting video essay. I wish I could remember who it was from, but off the top of my head. But yeah, it's about the idea that perhaps all of this is a metaphor, especially with the body stuff. The fact that Mrs. Gunash is this decrepit, you know, decaying person, and, you know, she suffers from the effects of, you know, visibly suffers from the effects of that, a sufferer of extreme body eating disorder would have, you know, the dehydration, the way it affects your skin, the, you know, around your eyes, your nails, etc. And then, of course, when Christina's cursed herself, she then, of course, suffers all of these things. And, of course, there is a lot of focus on orifices, particularly the mouth and the nose, and there is some really grotesque stuff. Of course, you know, about bodily fluids and things coming in and out of people's mouths, and it is horrific. It is, even I, you know, found it really grotesque to watch and quite horrifying and disgusting. And again, of course, that could feed into that interpretation about the whole idea of, you know, someone's relationship with food, and of course with being sick, and it all could be thematic. And then, of course, there's a more straightforward feminist reading of it, because, of course, the whole cause of the events is the fact that Christine is trying to get this promotion and is being overlooked by her boss for a guy who's just started. And again, it's one white straight man potentially giving a promotion to another white straight man, although their sexualities are never mentioned, but, you know, one would assume. And even though, you know, as I say, Christine is this perfect, you know, has worked on crafting herself to be this perfect image of a person, still is being rejected and denied. And like I say, the obvious sort of reading about misogyny, workplace misogyny, and sort of cultural misogyny are all there. I mean, you even have it then with her boyfriend's parents, and the whole thing about her not being the right kind of girl. Even though, like I said, she's perfect, she is this perfect image, and yet she's still not good enough. And then, of course, when we meet Mrs. Gunash, who is this grotesque person who, you know, is constantly coughing, and which, of course, in 2021, with someone coughing and spluttering and bringing things up, the context there is very changed from a post pandemic world. But as I say, you know, the fact that she is sort of this grotesque creature, and, you know, that only gives Christine more of a reason to then reject her and deny her and humiliate her, which is all that happens, and then that, of course, leads to Christine's cursing. But again, it's the idea that she is stepping on a woman who is seen as lesser, an older woman, a woman of no use, a sickly woman, and Christine essentially is putting her foot on that woman's head to succeed when she shouldn't have to. You know, again, it sort of feeds in, you know, like I say, the feminist sort of readings are there. And again, like I say, the class stuff, the stuff with the fact that she has this sort of sort of lightly referred to backstory, but also, you know, her boyfriend's parents want there's a real classist reading of it and real capitalist reading of it. Of course, the corporate structuring and the fact that she's constantly trying to climb her way to the top, and if that means someone loses their home, that so be it. And the fact that she's not the right class, you can apply these same readings whether you apply it in sort of a feminist context or more of a capitalist context. And there is that sense of the old world and the new, the fact that she's part of this fast-moving, fast-paced corporate world. Her boyfriend is a professor who's sort of very much in a psychology professor, and so he's focused on the mind and rationality, and yet you have this sort of link to the old world and the old ways, and how easily she slips from one into the other, and the idea of curses and the relationship between the human world and the demonic. And it all, like I say, that's the beauty of this story, is there are so many layers and readings and interpretations to it. And that Sam Raimi really crafts that. I mean, something else I should talk about is sort of the colour palette and the editing and the way that certain sequences are cut together are so bright and vivid, whereas people would expect horror to be dank and all shadow-based, and even fight scenes, quote-unquote, in a horror film should be in the dark, and yet Sam Raimi is almost completely rejecting of that. The scene in the car park where Mrs. Ganesh attacks Christine, that fight scene, which is all what you can really call it, is shot almost comedically, because again, his comedic sensibilities are amongst it all, and some people would say, oh well, it's a comedy horror because there are funny sequences. It's not. It is a tried and true horror film. But again, the way it's shot and the way it's choreographed is just so sharp and bright, and like I say, the colour palette is so strong in it. The way he uses zooms and cuts, and like I say, I'm so looking forward to Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, because like so many, I'm really hoping that the Doctor Strange sequel leans into the horror aspects of Doctor Strange, and yet we want this palette, this bright palette with it as well, and I think Sam Raimi could be the director who brings all of that to a Doctor Strange sequel and still leans into the horror within a safe Marvel Disney context. But like I say, the Drag Me to Hell, it is such a good film. It's such a strong modern horror story that, like I say, finds ways to give us characters and interpretations and interactions with the demonic, which, one could say, well, isn't that played out with James Wan and all the stuff with the paranormal activities and the Insidiouses, and yet, right in amongst it is Drag Me to Hell, and yet it has such a different personality, and definitely the kind of storytelling that I would want to see more of. Now, we're nearly a decade on, as I say, so horror has gone in very different directions since then, but I definitely would love to see just another film of this ilk. Maybe Sam Raimi, once he's done with Spider-Man, perhaps we'll see. Spider-Man with Doctor Strange, perhaps we'll see. But anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below and share the video, because that's all helped me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 250 videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.